Hello everybody, and welcome to another of our videos looking at Tsarist and Communist Russia. Today we're going to concentrate on domestic and military reforms under Alexander II. And this is helping us answer the key question: how was Russia governed and how did political authority change and develop? So Alexander II can be seen as a great reformer, and we've already looked at the emancipation of the serfs, and this is a continuation in that vein, but a lot of the reforms are quite limited. Right, so we're going to start with the military reforms, which is not really a big surprise, given that one of the major motivations for reform was Russia's really poor showing in the Crimean War. The reforms are carried out by Dmitry Milutin, and most of them go through in 1874. Now, there's several things in this that really changed. Now, previously, conscription had been confined largely to the serfs, but now it is brought out across the entire population. So all males aged 20 were eligible for military service, and the nobility could no longer get out of it. Now there's a massive reduction in the period of service. Before this, really, being conscripted was almost seen as like a death sentence, because it was 25 years, and 25 years in the Russian army was a long time to survive. It drops down to 6, with 9 years in reserve. There is quite a lot of effort put into improving the welfare of the Russian soldiers. So they abolished the most brutal forms of punishment. They still used a lot of corporal punishment in the army, and they improved the basic living conditions that the soldiers were in. They set up military colleges, and the idea of this was to provide better training, and they were trying to start to break through this old hierarchical system they had, where everybody at the top was always from the nobility. So they were trying to find people of ability and train them as officers as well, even if they weren't quite so highly born. They also had campaigns to improve the literacy and other education amongst the troops. So these education campaigns had some impact, and did quite a lot to increase the literacy rates in Russia, which were really low. They also stopped using military service as a punishment for criminal offences, and this is going to be important because one of the other major issues that you'd have with the Russian army at this point is it was full of criminals, and therefore it was full of people who didn't want to be there, and it didn't really inspire the others in the army to kind of see it as a good place to be if it is something that is used as a punishment. There was also some improvements in technology and transport. So there was introduction of some modern weapons and some battleships. There was development of the rail network. Russia's rail network really was a long way behind that of Western Europe, to try and improve the ability to move troops around, because the other problem with the Russian Empire is it is gigantic. So there is some things to be positive about and to celebrate and say, look, some of these reforms really did work and things are going in the right direction. However, the vast majority of the Russian army is still peasant conscripts, because they are the vast majority of the population. Therefore, if you conscript across the population, they're still going to be the majority of the people. Almost all the officers were still from the aristocratic class, and therefore there isn't really a proper meritocracy with people being raised to the top because of their ability, and an awful lot is still determined by birth. Now, even if you improve training and everything else in the military, Russia really did still struggle because their industry wasn't up to it. And so they didn't have the cutting-edge technology that there was in places like Germany and Britain, and they didn't produce enough kind of materials. They didn't produce enough rifles. They didn't produce enough ammunition, and so in a lot of this way, they're still behind the major powers, and rather worryingly, some not quite so major ones as well. And this problem that's been in the Crimea of Russian soldiers being short on weapons doesn't go away. It's still going to be there through the wars that they're going to be fighting from this point onwards. The next war they fight, therefore probably the best way of us judging how their reforms are going, is fought against the Ottoman Empire, 1877, 1878, and they won. But it wasn't a great victory. It took an awful lot longer than it should. They are not fighting against a very powerful opposition. They do gain a control of large Bulgaria. But when we go forward beyond that, if we get to the kind of the major wars in the future, they're going to suffer really badly in the war against Japan, 1904, 1905, which is a real blow to the Tsar at the time, Nicholas II. and we are going to also see that they were no match for Germany in World War One. So things got better, but they're still not very good, and that is often the story with things happening in Tsarist Russia. A little bit of improvement, but still not very good. Right, so another area of reform is domestic reform is local government, and what we see set up here are these zemstva. Now these are kind of local government. They're assemblies at district and provincial level, and they were elected. And so it looks like a massive breakthrough. This is really, really important, but they operate in this really odd way. The elections take place, and everybody has a vote, or a male kind of universal suffrage, but the votes go into what's known as electoral college. So the electoral college was divided into a section for nobility, a section for townspeople, a section for the church, and a section for the peasants. Now, because of the way the number of electoral college votes each section got, it still meant, even though there was much, much fewer nobles, they still carried a huge proportion of the electoral college vote. So in a way, it didn't really matter hugely which way the peasants voted, because their voice was hugely shrunk by the use of the electoral college. So nobility continued to dominate. These zemstvas controlled things like education, health, transport, and poor relief, so they had a reasonable amount of power. The chairman of a zemstvo, so as an individual one, so it's a singular, it had to come from a noble family. So again, it's reinforcing that nobility stranglehold on things, which they really expected to happen, because they come from a period of serfdom where they actually owned all the local people. So an idea they wouldn't have complete control and hold all the high political office would have been a really difficult thing for the nobility to get their heads around. It had no control over state or local taxation. Control of law and order didn't control that. That was outside their hands, in the hands of the provincial governor, who was directly appointed by the Tsar. And then we also see some urban assemblies called dumas, which were established in 1870. So if we just assess this a bit further, well, the liberals really thought this was the start of genuine change. So they got really excited. You can see my little character getting excited at the top. And they could start to see the possibilities of a new modern Russia with democracy, and it's all going to get better. And the zemstva themselves often became a place where the educated classes debated political issues, but when they debated it, they tended to disagree with what the Tsarist government were doing, and so they tended to start being critical, and the Tsar can't take criticism. He doesn't like criticism, he's not used to criticism, and so we start to get a bit of a bite back against that. Now, Alexander II didn't intend the zemstva to be an important way of bringing in democracy. He saw them as being a way to maintain autocracy. And when there was this attempt by representatives of the zemstva to try and create a national assembly made up from their membership, he very quickly pointed out they didn't have any power. He held all of it, and they should go away. And so really, although this is a step in the right direction, it does start to allow some voice to some Russian people. It doesn't necessarily start to move away from autocracy. Another really interesting area of reform is in the law and looking at the judiciary. So with the serfs no longer being property, they now have access to the law. And so the legal system had to change rather dramatically. And there were some really quite significant measures, and almost you can see the reforms here going probably further than they did elsewhere. So legal proceedings were conducted in public. There was a freedom of press to report what was going on. It didn't matter which class you were from, you had access to the courts. Charges were assessed by jury trial. Judges were independent, and they were given some training and better pay. And then there was justices of the peace that were elected by the zemstvas every 3 years. So we started to see a system which really does look a lot more advanced than what they've been before. But there's still a bit of warning of the autocracy lingering, because the Tsar can impose martial law during times of emergency, and he does this in the 1870s. But most Russians are seeing a kind of real improvement from the old harsh regime and serfdom and what had gone before to something far more open. Now, it did start to cause some problems. Now, although the system is a lot less corrupt and is a lot fairer than it used to be, we start to see some really interesting developments, which we think are probably quite good, and the Tsar thought was really quite bad. So some of these really articulate, skilled barristers from the intelligentsia got a real kind of platform. Going to court became a quite common form of entertainment, and so they gained this kind of almost state of celebrity, these barristers, and they were often challenging these people in positions of power. And then we've got this. I love this story of Vera Zasluch. I have probably said that completely wrong. I'm really bad with Russian pronunciation, but we've got this case where juries had a tendency, if they really liked the person or they sympathised with why they did something, they had a tendency to let them off, even if they were clearly guilty. And this case of Zasluch is a really good one of it. So there's General Trepov. General Trepov had ordered the flogging of Alexei. I really struggle with this one. Boglyabov. If anyone wants to comment and correct me on my pronunciation, please do. So this guy, he refuses to take off his hat in deference to the general, and the general demands that he is flogged with sticks. Now, there was a plot to do something about this, but Vera kind of stepped in before anything happened, and she shot the general. Everyone knew she shot the general. He was really badly wounded, but not killed. She went to trial. Again, everybody knew she did it. But she was acquitted because the jury were sympathetic towards her and not very sympathetic towards General Trepov. And so we start to see a bit of a problem for the Tsarist system here. So they start to bring in special procedures for what they deemed to be political crimes, and also juries were not used in certain parts of the empire where there was more difficulties for the Tsar's control, like Poland and the Caucasus. And then in the church courts, the ecclesiastical courts, and in the military courts, they didn't use juries in those either. So the reform, in a way, is quite difficult for the Tsar because they don't like the results of it. And there is some really interesting byproducts of the reform. Right, education was another area where Russia was massively behind. And this was largely because the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, had controlled education. Now, if Russia was going to modernize, then they needed a new and more enlightened education system and things that was going to prepare people for a new industrial world. And also now the serfs have been emancipated, they need to be able to look after themselves. So they need greater literacy and numeracy. Now, Alexander Golovin, who is the education minister, he's charged with bringing things in, and he does quite a significant amount in largely 1863, 1864. So the universities are given a great deal of freedom, and they run their own affairs. They appoint their own professors. There's a little bit of the Ministry of Education keeping an eye on them, but with a liberal education minister, that doesn't seem to be a massive problem. The zemstva take control of education from the church, but remember the church has a say in the zemstva as one of the areas of the electoral college, and the nobility still dominate. So that might make things a bit better, but not completely. Now, there is universal primary education, but that is essentially a load of religion plus basic numeracy, literacy, and that kind of thing. There are secondary schools, and this is where some of those skills and things you hope are going to be developed, but only if you can afford to go, because they're fee paying, and most people can't afford to go. Education was available regardless of class or gender, and so we do see a large number of changes coming out because of this, and the number of kids in primary school went up by a multiple of 3. The number of university students went up by about the same multiple, but if you look at the actual raw numbers, they ended up with 10,000 students in Russia, which, if you think about it in the context of modern Britain, for example, is not very many. And then they started causing problems. There was more students, they were being educated, they were being encouraged to think, and that causes problems in Russia. So because they started to be attracted to liberal and radical ideas, and then they started civil disobedience, and so the universities were kind of clamped down on from 1866 onwards, because free thought was not really to be encouraged because it was causing problems rather than thinking about how it could modernize and improve Russia. Right, there are a series of other domestic reforms, and so we've got bits we should get excited about, like the relaxation of censorship on the press and on books, So you could even publish foreign books without prior government approval. Something that was a major breakthrough. And the number of books published went up dramatically. Again, it's still really quite low if you look at those numbers. So 1,000 in 1855, just under 2,000 in 64, up to over 10,000 in 1894. But as there was more books, more of these publications and things were critical of the Tsar and his government. And so in the 1870s, a lot of that censorship that had been peeled back was reimposed. There was some reform of the Russian Orthodox Church following a report that highlighted the poverty and the unsuitability of a lot of the rural priests, who just really didn't know what they were doing. And Dmitry Tolstoy, however, took control of reforms in the church and really restricted what was doing. He was really kind of reactionary character. There was some restrictions relaxed for some of the ethnic minorities, notably the Poles, who were largely Catholic. The Finns were given a degree of self-rule, and also there was a loosening of some of the really harsh restrictions on the Jewish population. The Finns kept their hold of their kind of new rights for a longer period of time, but the Poles and the Jews lost them really, really quickly and were to go on and face some fairly horrendous, some really horrendous persecution, particularly under Alexander III. So things had got better, but only a bit. Right. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, to share, to comment, to subscribe. Check out our other videos on Russia, and then there's plenty of other stuff on other areas of history and politics as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all again soon.